Hey folks, welcome to Bear Mountain today. Working on a little experiment with snapdragons. I think you guys might find this interesting, so let's go walk through it. Okay, this is what happened. Last fall we planted our overwintering snaps, and we'll show you some pictures of how they kind of came out. And we did this using the JADAM method. We used a lot of microorganism solution JMS and also fertilized with JLF. Particularly in the spring when they started growing again in February. And they really produced very well. And when they were finished producing right around the end of May, I came in and I cut the plants down, leaving the root systems in place. I cut the plants down to about 2 inches. But with a whole lot of other things going on in personal life, etc., I got the vast majority of the excess stuff cleaned out. But some of the stuff that was just kind of dropped or cut in small pieces on the bed itself ended up being laid down there as a mulch. And then we basically fallowed the tunnel for the summer, meaning we never watered in here at all. What was surprising was those snapdragons actually survived. Okay, so this is the bed itself, and it's about 40 feet long. It wasn't a super big bed of snapdragons, but what we thought we would do is we would just see if we could grow these guys on again, because this is essentially what they looked like after a summer of no water at all. They actually began to resprout, and some of the stems that are still green have little buds on them. So this has kind of been a fantastic just little experiment on just how much moisture, once you get the biology going in the soil, you can actually keep in the soil available for plants. I mean, one of the things is that during this last summer, for us in Western Oregon, it was incredibly hot and incredibly dry. We had no rain really, so to speak of, for a good 90 days. And so there was no real moisture in the soil outside the tunnel, and there was no irrigation going on inside the tunnel. And these guys ended up surviving. Pretty fantastic. So when you start taking a closer look, what you begin to see is that the plants themselves actually are looking pretty healthy. And this is a time when they're going to put on a bit of vegetative growth, and the spacing still looks pretty good. It's got a good mulch on the top. And this is a whole bunch of different varieties. We have Costa series in here, Cool series, as well as Chantilly. So these guys, I think, are going to end up, getting a little bit bigger before we go into the low light levels. And then they should be in a pretty good shape for next spring. So here's a closer example of this right here is Cool series, and we're kind of transitioning into some of the Chantillies in the back. But when I look at individual plants, what I can start to see is I can start to see that there's at least 3 or 4 good side stems that are going to start to grow out of these guys. And so what we decided to do is we're going to fertilize these guys with the JADAM liquid fertilizer. Just start back up on the same regime we used last year, and then see, how things are going. And so far at this point, I've already applied 1 dosage about 7 days ago of JLF, and that was in combination with the microbe solution. And they've already greened up a lot just since then. But these guys were, beat up pretty good, so they survived, and I think, they're going to grow out of some of these yellow foliage and the things of that nature. The foliage is healthy. I don't see any disease on them. I don't see any rust or anything of that nature. So this is going to be kind of really interesting to see, how the soil continues to evolve in here and how much productivity we can get out. What I may have to do as we go through and get to next spring is I may want to pinch out and thin out a few side branches on these guys just to kind of keep them, to the strongest. But in essence, what we've just done here, if we make it through the winter and we get some productivity out of this, that means we got 2 years out of the same planting. So it's almost like treating a snapdragon as a tender perennial. So one of the things that I was curious about was, how did we actually, were we able to retain enough water in the ground without watering for 90 days or longer? Actually, we didn't water this thing since the end of May until, you know, I came back in here and started working on it again towards the end of September. So we're talking pretty close to 4 months with no water being added to it, and these plants survived. Well, one of the things that I think is kind of interesting is how much deeper the soil is relative to finding a compaction layer. When we started planting in this bed last year, the compaction layer was down, roughly around 10 to 12 inches, and which was okay. It's not great, but we've been treating this stuff with, like I said, in the spring and then the winter with JMS and the liquid fertilizer. And one of the things, I guess, what I thought I would do is just do a test just to see how deep I can push this fence rod in before I hit some significant resistance. So got the rod. This is a 4-foot rod, and I'll just kind of push it down and see where it goes. It's not really putting a whole lot of, hard pushing on it. I'm getting pretty close to right about there. So it looks like if I was to measure this on the rod, I'd say I'm about pretty close to 20 inch. So I gained about 4 inches, but that, from where that marker is to the tip, is to where the compaction layer is. So there is quite a bit of root space in there that could be working on that. So that's actually pretty good. And what I have found is that's pretty consistent for the whole bed. Some places actually were a little deeper, and a couple places, maybe towards the front of the bed up here, where the growth isn't that great, were a little shallower. But overall, this has been no tillage to this bed whatsoever. Really for 3 years, we've never tilled in here. The only time we did anything from a soil standpoint was when we originally built the greenhouse, we came through and forked the beds. But everything has been relying on mulch and just the biology of the plants that's been planted in here. So let's take a look at the fertilizer system. So when you look at the head of the bed, what you see is, you can see I've got multiple lines in here, but only 3 of them are actually hooked up. One of them I got to remove because it actually has some rodent damage to it, so I'm going to be pulling that out. But each of the individual lines has its own shutoff valve so that I can turn off individual beds. I've got 3 beds in this entire house, so I can run 1 bed only, or even just 2 beds, or whatever it is that makes sense. And I also, past the Snapdragons, I temporarily put kind of a kink in the drip lines to give it a blockage, so it won't water any more than about 45 feet on this bed with the fertilizer solution. So this main line then, that you can see, flows over to basically a temporary setup. Now the temporary setup is got the siphon right where the hose comes in that goes to the easy flow. You can see that's in the white tank. And then that is where the fertilizer comes into the system, goes through a filtration process. There's a check valve to prevent it from getting into the system. There's also a check valve out at the main line where the hose connects up. So we'll take a look at that in a second. But I just wanted to put enough in there that I don't get any, something burping back up into the systems. And then there's a pressure reducer, and then off into the lines to the bed itself. Now this tank is the same tank we used up on the zinnias when we were applying the JLF up there for the zinnias for the summer season. So I wanted to see just how well this would work, and it seems to be working pretty well down here. So I can adjust, when I plant the other beds out in the house this fall, when I put the ranunculus in, I can tap in and put some fertilizer in there. The fertilizer, before we put it in the tank, what we do is we use we use a 200 mesh screen filter system so that any oversized material doesn't get caught in the tank or plug things up. And that seems to work pretty good. The JMS though, since we're applying that, we haven't yet mixed it in the tank, the fertilizer tank itself. So I've been applying the JMS manually to this short bed, just using a mixed up soil drench. So I dilute it to 1 to 50 for these plants because I don't want to shock them too much, and then that gets applied at least twice a month. The drip system with the JLF is applied at a 1 to 400 dilution and takes a little bit longer over a period of time. I'd run for 20 minutes at a time, and so I'll irrigate the fertilizer basically over a series of a couple, 3 or 4 days to get the fertilizer into the plants itself. Okay, so the drip irrigation system is actually pretty simple. This is a frost-free valve. It's connected first to a timer, which is set to regulate the 20-minute watering intervals and then space that over several days. And then there's a white check valve right below the timer, and then it flows into the hose itself, which then goes into the tunnel, and we already talked about that hookup. So it's double protected from anything, in case something burps back up. It's pretty much protected from the fertilizer tank and also protected from anything maybe backflowing actually from the drip lines itself. All right, what you've probably seen at this point is that there's a mulch around the plant, and that's just basically the straw residue left from chopped up snapdragons. There are some small seedlings and maybe some minor weeds that are starting to germinate. And I'm thinking what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna come through here probably in November and just apply a thin mulch of urban compost over the top, just to kind of help seal things in. And that's it basically, other than putting up a netting starting next spring before these guys really start to grow. I'm kind of thinking that they're gonna bush up pretty good. There's a few spots where we had plants that actually really did die, but I think there's enough density in the bed that there's not gonna be a problem with this. So this is gonna be a really interesting experiment. So thanks folks for joining along on this, and I thought this was just kind of a really interesting thing. I mean, it kind of amazed me. Usually, when you cut something down, pretty much dies, when it's a regular flower, and I just figured, well, okay, when I got back to it, the root systems, would be pretty well rotted out, and yeah, I could just basically kind of apply a nice little mulch to it and plant away with new plants. But these guys want to go at it again. So it's going to be kind of interesting to see if we can, make it through the winter and come out with something on the back end. Perennializing snapdragons, is that a thing? Could be. Thanks for watching, folks. And as always, stay safe out there, and we'll catch you on the next video. Bye-bye.